The Curate's Quietus, a mystery, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, devoted listeners. I'm Connor, and tonight we're settling in with a most intriguing tale of village secrets, botanical horrors, and the extraordinary deductive mind of Miss Jane Marple. This story comes to us from the village of Lymstock in the autumn of 1934, where a simple ecclesiastical appointment becomes the catalyst for murder most strange. The fog is rolling in thick across the moors tonight, so do light your candles and ensure your door is firmly latched. We begin our investigation where all good mysteries must begin, with an arrival that no one could have anticipated would prove so profoundly fatal. Chapter 1. The curate arrives at the Lich Gate. The November rain had been falling upon Lymstock with the relentless persistence of something determined to test the patience of even the most devout parishioner. Miss Jane Marple, carefully making her way along the high street with her shopping basket secured beneath her arm, observed with mild interest how the rain seemed to transform the ordinary village into something rather more atmospheric than its daytime self. The church bells had tolled at 3 o'clock that afternoon, announcing to the village that Reverend Clement had finally recruited assistants for the parish work that had long been consuming his increasingly frail constitution. She paused outside the post office to adjust her gloves, noting with her characteristic attention to detail that Mrs. Hodges appeared to be having an animated conversation with someone through the window. The someone in question was tall, energetic, and possessed of the sort of youthful enthusiasm that seemed almost indecent in a man of the cloth. This must be the new curate, Miss Marple reflected, observing how his gestures were expansive and his voice, even muffled through that glass, carried the particular resonance of a man accustomed to making himself heard in large gatherings. The Reverend Clement had mentioned in passing, during the church flower committee meeting the previous week, that assistance was on its way. He had used the words with the tone of someone expressing gratitude, mixed with the faintest whisper of apprehension, a duality that Miss Marple had filed away for future reference. She had learned through a lifetime of careful observation that when the elderly express relief tempered by wariness, there is often a story worth discovering. The figure she observed now, however, seemed unlikely to cause the Reverend anything but satisfaction. Mr. Tansy, as she understood his name to be, possessed all the external attributes of the ideal assistant. His clerical collar was pristine, his shoes polished to a military shine, and his posture suggested a man of considerable physical vigour. Yet there was something about his expression, visible even at that distance through the post office window, that suggested energy untempered by reflection. Miss Marple continued her errands, purchasing her customary items from the grocer and pausing to collect a library book that had been reserved for her. It was as she turned toward the vicarage path that she encountered Reverend Clement himself, looking precisely as one might expect of a man who had recently acquired assistance with his parochial duties. He appeared simultaneously relieved and exhausted, a peculiar combination that suggested the curate's enthusiasm had perhaps already exceeded the Reverend's capacity to absorb. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly, though his eyes betrayed a certain weariness. "I trust you're managing well in this dreadful weather." "Quite well, thank you, Reverend," she replied with her customary serenity. "I understand congratulations are in order regarding your new curate. He appears to be a most energetic young man." Reverend Clement nodded, though his expression remained ambiguous. "Yes, indeed, Mr. Tansy comes highly recommended from his previous parish, most enthusiastic about his ecclesiastical duties. Perhaps, if I might venture an observation, rather more enthusiastic than one might ideally hope for in these quiet environs." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she habitually applied to any statement that seemed to suggest more than it explicitly conveyed. The Reverend's tone suggested not merely a gentle concern about excessive zeal, but something deeper, a disquiet that he seemed reluctant to articulate directly. "The garden is looking rather neglected," she observed, noting how the vicarage grounds had suffered from lack of attention. "I understand you have cultivated quite an extensive collection of botanical specimens over the years?" Reverend Clement's expression shifted immediately, becoming almost anxious. "Yes, well, the garden has always been my particular passion, though I confess I've been obliged to become somewhat more cautious in recent years regarding the more unusual species. Some of the plants require considerable care, and their properties can be rather delicate in nature." This observation, seemingly casual, contained within it a weight of significance that Miss Marple recognised immediately. The Reverend was not merely discussing horticultural management. He was offering, in his careful and genteel manner, a warning about something that troubled him considerably. "I have always admired your botanical knowledge," she said gently. "Few people in the village possess such extensive understanding of plant varieties and their particular characteristics." "Indeed," Reverend Clement replied, his voice now carrying a note of something that might have been alarm masked by ecclesiastical politeness. "Knowledge, Miss Marple, can be a burden as well as a blessing. There are certain plants, for instance, that are beautiful to observe, but whose properties are best left undisturbed by curious hands." They parted shortly afterward, Miss Marple conducting her customary visits to those parishioners who required attention, and the Reverend returning to his vicarage with the air of a man resigned to whatever evening his new curate might present. She reflected, as she made her way home through the dampening evening, that Reverend Clement's unusual display of concern suggested that Mr. Tansy's arrival represented something more than the simple addition of clerical support. Whether this something would prove dangerous remained to be seen. Chapter 2. Poison Blooms in the Vicarage Garden. The discovery of Mr. Tansy's body came not in the morning, as such discoveries often do, but in the evening of the very next day. Miss Marple was engaged in her usual Tuesday evening occupation, examining the financial records of the parish charity, when she received a visit from Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, whose face suggested that something of considerable consequence had occurred. "Jane, dear," Mrs. Calthrop began, her customary composure visibly shaken, "I fear there has been the most dreadful occurrence at the vicarage. The Reverend asked me to come and speak with you before the authorities arrive." Miss Marple set aside her papers immediately, recognising in her friend's demeanour the particular distress that accompanies not merely accident, but something far more calculated and sinister. "Do sit down, dear, and tell me everything." The story that emerged was as strange as it was disturbing. Mr. Tansy had been found dead in the vestry that morning, the body discovered by the verger as he arrived to prepare the church for the day's services. The manner of death was perhaps the most unsettling detail. Lodged firmly in Mr. Tansy's mouth, inserted with considerable force, was a specimen of Ricinus communis, the castor bean plant. But this was no ordinary castor bean plant. This was a particular specimen from Reverend Clement's extensive garden. Nay, one that the Reverend had cultivated specifically for its chemical properties. The seeds of the Ricinus communis plant contained ricin, one of the most potent poisons known to science. "The Reverend is quite beside himself," Mrs. Calthrop explained, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "He keeps insisting that the plant must have been taken from the garden without his knowledge. But the truth is that Mr. Tansy had been expressing considerable interest in the vicarage gardens. The Reverend had even shown him some of the more unusual specimens." "How very curious," Miss Marple observed, her mind already beginning to organise the various implications of this information. "A poison plant, deliberately placed in the victim's mouth, suggests not merely murder, but murder performed with considerable symbolic intention. This is the work of someone who wishes to convey a message, not simply to eliminate an inconvenience. It was as they were discussing these troubling particulars that the first of the mysterious notes was discovered. Placed prominently in the church pew where the most devoted of Lymstock's parishioners regularly sat, the note read simply, "Judge not that ye be not judged." Matthew 7:1. The handwriting was neat and meticulous, the paper quality suggesting it came from a respectable source. Within the hour, 3 more notes had been discovered throughout the church, each containing biblical verses that seemed, when examined carefully, to suggest justification, or at least explanation for the murder. "Thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live," Exodus 22:18. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Matthew 5:6. "The wages of sin is death," Romans 6:23. Inspector Slack arrived that afternoon, his sharp features already set in the expression of grim determination that Miss Marple had observed on previous investigations. He examined the notes with evident scepticism, and his questioning of the Reverend carried the implicit accusation of a man who suspected ecclesiastical propriety to be merely a mask for considerably more sinister motivations. "Reverend," the inspector began with characteristic bluntness, "these notes suggest that someone in this village believes your new curate deserved to die. Can you account for any enemies Mr. Tansy might have made during his brief tenure here?" Reverend Clement appeared genuinely bewildered by the question. Mr. Tansy was enthusiastic, perhaps occasionally overzealous in his pastoral approach. "But I cannot imagine anyone in Lymstock harbouring murderous feelings toward him." It was Miss Marple, however, who posed what seemed to her the more significant question. "Inspector, might I observe that these notes appear designed to suggest a religious motivation for the crime? Yet my experience suggests that false attributions of motive are often employed by those who possess entirely different, more material reasons for their actions." Inspector Slack fixed her with a look that suggested he was not entirely convinced of this reasoning. "You suggest, Miss Marple, that these pious notes are a deception meant to obscure the true motive?" "I suggest only that religious fervour is rarely the most efficient killer," she replied carefully. "In my experience, greed, jealousy, and fear motivate far more murders than do matters of doctrine." Chapter 3. Letters Concealing a Darker Truth. The investigation proceeded over the following days with the methodical precision that Inspector Slack always brought to criminal matters. The notes continued to appear throughout the village, each containing obscure biblical references that seemed to justify the murder in progressively more elaborate terms. The village became increasingly divided between those who suspected Reverend Clement of orchestrating the crime to rid himself of an inconvenient assistant, and those who believed a religious fanatic of considerable theological knowledge must be responsible. Yet Miss Marple found herself growing increasingly sceptical of both theories. She began, as was her habit, to examine the most mundane aspects of Mr. Tansy's brief life in Lymstock. What had his financial circumstances been? What connections did he possess outside the ecclesiastical sphere? How had he spent his evenings, beyond the apparent routine of prayer and pastoral duty? It was Mrs. Hodges at the post office who provided the first crucial insight. That Mr. Tansy, she confided to Miss Marple while sorting through the afternoon's correspondence, was forever receiving letters from solicitors. Legal documents, they looked like to me. Not the sort of thing you'd expect a curate to be involved with, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple took her meaning very clearly indeed. She made discreet inquiries through those channels available to a woman of her position in the village, and gradually a picture emerged that diverged sharply from the character that Mr. Tansy had presented to Reverend Clement. Mr. Tansy, it seemed, was involved in a property dispute with a neighbouring landowner, a man named Mr. Pemberton, who owned the estate adjacent to the church lands. The dispute, according to the information Miss Marple was able to gather, concerned the exact boundaries of the two properties. Documents of considerable antiquity suggested that the church lands extended further than current occupation suggested, and Mr. Tansy had apparently been gathering evidence to support a claim that might have resulted in a substantial transfer of property from Mr. Pemberton's holdings to the vicarage. "How very interesting," Miss Marple mused to Mrs. Dane Calthrop during one of their afternoon conversations. "It appears that Mr. Tansy, for all his ecclesiastical enthusiasm, he was engaged in what amounts to a substantial property dispute. Such matters have motivated murder countless times throughout history." "But surely," Mrs. Calthrop protested, "one would not poison a man merely over a question of land boundaries." "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "land represents security, inheritance, and the promise of future wealth. In my experience, people have killed for considerably less substantial motivations than those." It was the discovery of Mr. Tansy's personal correspondence that provided the crucial breakthrough. Inspector Slack, having obtained the appropriate legal authority, examined the contents of Mr. Tansy's room at the parish lodging-house. Among his effects were found several drafts of letters addressed to the bishop, letters in which Mr. Tansy expressed grave concerns about Reverend Clement's mental fitness to continue in his position. The letters suggested that Reverend Clement had become erratic and potentially dangerous, fixated upon his botanical specimens to an unhealthy degree, and given to expressing ideas that the curate considered potentially heretical. "This changes everything," the inspector declared grimly. "We have a motive rooted not in theology, but in ecclesiastical advancement. Mr. Tansy was attempting to discredit the Reverend, to position himself as the natural successor to the vicarage." Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. "Inspector, if I might observe, these letters are relatively recent and appear to have been drafted but never sent. Whoever composed them understood that sending such accusations would be imprudent. But there is another consideration that seems to me equally important. These notes that continue to appear, each citing scripture, each seemingly designed to suggest religious motivation, they appear far more sophisticated in their execution than would be expected from Mr. Pemberton, who is a man of limited education." "You suggest multiple perpetrators?" the inspector asked, his scepticism evident. "I suggest," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that we should examine not merely who had motive to kill Mr. Tansy, but who had motive to ensure that the killing appeared to be motivated by religious fanaticism rather than simple greed." Chapter 4. The Verger's Secret Confessions. It was through the verger, Mr. Pitman, that the truth began finally to emerge. Mr. Pitman was a man of considerable age and limited means. None. One who had served the church for 40 years with the quiet dedication of one for whom the sacred building represented the entire substance of his existence. He was also, it transpired, the cousin of Mr. Pemberton, the neighbouring landowner whose property was threatened by Mr. Tansy's claims regarding the boundary dispute. Inspector Slack, following Miss Marple's suggestion to examine the personal connections of those closely associated with the deceased, discovered that Mr. Pitman had received a substantial gift of money from Mr. Pemberton in the weeks immediately preceding Mr. Tansy's death. The amount was sufficient to represent significant wealth for a man of the verger's limited circumstances. When confronted with this evidence, Mr. Pitman's resistance collapsed with remarkable swiftness. He confessed that Mr. Pemberton had approached him with a proposition. Mr. Tansy's interest in the boundary dispute made him a threat to Mr. Pemberton's financial interests. If Mr. Tansy were to die, the property claim would likely die with him, and Mr. Pemberton's estate would remain secure. The money offered to Mr. Pitman was compensation for his assistance in acquiring a specimen of the Ricinus communis from Reverend Clement's garden, and for his willingness to place the poisoned plant in the vestry where Mr. Tansy would be certain to discover it. "I didn't intend for him to die," Mr. Pitman insisted desperately. his aged face crumpling with remorse. "I simply placed the plant where he would find it. I thought perhaps it would frighten him, convince him to abandon his claims. I never imagined he would attempt to eat it." Yet here lay the genius of the murder, as Miss Marple recognised. The killer, whether acting alone or in concert, had understood that a man confronted with such a specimen from a hostile source and simultaneously exposed to a series of scriptural notes suggesting divine judgment might well consume the poison in a state of fear and confusion, believing perhaps that to do so would constitute some form of penance or expiation. The notes, Miss Marple observed to the inspector, were designed to accomplish multiple purposes. They would create an atmosphere of religious extremism that would distract attention from the actual motive of property acquisition. They would also, when combined with the physical presence of the poison plant, create in Mr. Tansy's mind a sense of theological judgment and divine retribution, Tansy, potentially triggering the very behaviour that would result in his death. "So someone orchestrated the entire affair," the inspector said grimly, "using both physical means and psychological manipulation to ensure the victim's demise. Someone with considerable knowledge of Mr. Tansy's psychology," Miss Marple agreed, "and equal knowledge of village superstitions and religious belief. Someone, I might venture, who possessed both education and cunning." The investigation that followed, building upon Mr. Pitman's confession, revealed that Mr. Pemberton had indeed orchestrated the entire affair. He had researched Mr. Tansy's movements, discovered his interest in botanical specimens, and had even crafted the scriptural notes himself, using references drawn from the Bible to create an impression of religious obsession. Most damning of all, he had employed Mr. Pitman not merely as an accomplice in retrieving the poison plant, but as a witness who would later provide credible testimony regarding his own participation in the crime, thereby shifting attention away from Mr. Pemberton himself. Chapter 5. The Reverend's Dangerous Collection. As the investigation progressed, attention necessarily turned toward Reverend Clement's botanical collection and the question of how such dangerous specimens had come to be cultivated within the vicarage grounds. The Reverend, when confronted with this matter, proved forthcoming in his explanation, though his apparent naivety regarding the risks he had created was somewhat alarming to those charged with public safety. "I collected these specimens purely for scientific study," Reverend Clement explained to the inspector, leading him through the glass-enclosed garden that adjoined the vicarage. "Many of the plants here possess remarkable chemical and medicinal properties. The Ricinus communis, for instance, produces oil that has legitimate pharmaceutical applications. It seemed to me that understanding the plant world in all its manifestations was part of understanding God's creation." "Yet you made no effort to secure these specimens," the inspector observed sharply, "nor did you restrict access to the garden." "I confess I did not," the Reverend admitted, his expression suggesting genuine distress at this lapse. "I showed Mr. Tansy the collection during his second week of residence. He expressed considerable interest in botanical matters, and I thought it might be pleasant for us to share this particular enthusiasm." It was during this examination of the garden that Miss Marple made an observation that seemed to strike the Reverend with particular force. "Reverend," she inquired gently, "how long had the Ricinus communis specimen been missing from the collection before Mr. Tansy's death?" The Reverend appeared puzzled by the question. "Missing? It was not missing. The specimen that was placed in Mr. Tansy's mouth was— Oh, good heavens!" His face paled. "You mean to say that Mr. Pitman did not take it at all?" "I mean to suggest," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that we examine precisely when this specimen was last observed, by whom, and under what circumstances." The investigation that followed this line of inquiry revealed that the Ricinus communis specimen had indeed vanished from the Reverend's collection some 3 weeks prior to Mr. Tansy's death. The Reverend had noticed its absence, but had attributed the disappearance to weather damage or some other natural cause, and had assumed it would regenerate. The specimen discovered in Mr. Tansy's mouth, upon careful examination, proved to be a replacement, one that Mr. Pemberton had obtained through a correspondent in London who supplied botanical specimens to collectors and scientific institutions. This revelation suggested that Mr. Pemberton's plan had been conceived well in advance, long before Mr. Pitman became involved or the scriptural notes were composed. Mr. Pemberton had identified a weapon, secured the means to obtain it, and then constructed an elaborate framework of misdirection designed to shift suspicion toward religious obsession rather than property disputes. The original theft from the garden, Miss Marple explained to the inspector, was not Mr. Pemberton's work, but rather the work of some villager engaging in adolescent mischief, or possibly attempting to claim a specimen for themselves. Mr. Pemberton, however, seized upon this opportunity. He obtained a replacement specimen identical to the original, and then proceeded with his more elaborate machinations. Chapter 6. Botanical Bonds and Financial Fraud. Further investigation of Mr. Pemberton's affairs revealed that his motive extended beyond simple preservation of property boundaries. The man had, in fact, engaged in substantial financial irregularities that Mr. Tansy's property claims threatened to expose. The boundary dispute, it transpired, touched upon land that contained valuable minerals that Mr. Pemberton had been illegally extracting and selling without proper licensing or compensation to the church authorities. Inspector Slack, working with solicitors appointed by the ecclesiastical authorities, uncovered documentation of a mining operation that had been conducted in deliberate secrecy upon what should have constituted church property. Over the course of several years, Mr. Pemberton had extracted limestone and other valuable mineral deposits, selling them to construction companies and quarry operators throughout the region. The profit from these unauthorized extractions represented a sum of considerable magnitude, it amounting to several £1,000s, a fortune in the rural economy of 1934. Mr. Tansy, in his characteristic zeal for ecclesiastical duty, had discovered evidence of these unauthorized extractions while researching the property dispute. He had been conducting a meticulous examination of historical documents pertaining to the vicarage lands when he had encountered references to mining activity in the boundary region. Curious by nature, and possessed of the naive conviction that ecclesiastical authorities must be informed of any transgression against church property, he had begun collecting documentation with methodical precision. His correspondence with the bishop's office, discovered among his effects, demonstrated his intention to bring comprehensive charges against Mr. Pemberton, and not merely regarding boundary disputes, but regarding systematic theft of church resources and fraud concerning the reporting of his mineral sales to the relevant authorities. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. Mr. Tansy, should he have proceeded with his documented intentions, would have resulted in Mr. Pemberton's complete financial ruin. Prosecution under both civil and ecclesiastical law would have been inevitable, and the recovery of stolen resources would have depleted Mr. Pemberton's personal fortune substantially. Beyond the financial consequences, the scandal would have destroyed Mr. Pemberton's standing in the county, rendering him incapable of conducting any business activities whatever. "It is a remarkable thing," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Dane Calthrop as the full scope of the conspiracy unfolded, "how greed wears the mask of various motivations depending upon what the murderer believes will most effectively conceal the true nature of his crime. Mr. Pemberton, understanding that ecclesiastical matters stir passions in village communities, employed religious imagery and language to distract attention from what was essentially a straightforward matter of theft and murder for financial gain. The discovery of Mr. Pemberton's correspondence with his London supplier and confidant, Mr. Greaves, revealed that the entire affair had been orchestrated with considerable premeditation. The letters themselves, written in a form of careful code that suggested long practice in such communications, outlined plans to acquire the poison plant, to identify a suitable village accomplice, and to construct the elaborate framework of scriptural notes designed to create the impression of religious obsession. The correspondence demonstrated that Mr. Pemberton had been communicating with Mr. Greaves regarding the threat posed by Mr. Tansy's investigations for several weeks prior to the curate's actual death. One letter, dated 3 months before Mr. Tansy's arrival in Lymstock, struck Inspector Slack as particularly revealing. Written by Mr. Greaves in response to Mr. Pemberton's detailed account of the mineral extraction operation and the threat posed by an expected increase in ecclesiastical scrutiny, it read, "Your situation presents both danger and opportunity. The threat of exposure is certainly real and immediate. However, if handled with appropriate subtlety, this threat might be transformed into an instrument of your liberation. When the obstacle presents itself, we shall remove it permanently, and with such careful misdirection that suspicion will attach itself to any convenient fanatic, rather than to the obvious beneficiary of his demise. Religious communities are remarkably susceptible to narratives of zealotry and divine judgment. A competent craftsman might weave such a narrative so convincingly that the village itself would construct the evidence of guilt, while the actual architect of the removal remains beneath suspicion. This letter, more than any other piece of evidence, demonstrated the calculating nature of the conspiracy. Mr. Greaves had not merely assisted in planning a murder. He had, in fact, orchestrated a comprehensive scheme of psychological manipulation designed to exploit the particular vulnerabilities and predilections of the village community of Lymstock. The selection of Mr. Tansy as the victim was not incidental to this plan. Rather, Mr. Greaves had apparently calculated with considerable precision that the elimination of an energetic and zealous young curate would be interpreted by a largely religious population as an act of religious violence rather than simple murder for profit. A subsequent examination of Mr. Greaves's own correspondence files revealed even more disturbing evidence of calculation. Among his papers was a detailed study of the village of Lymstock, compiled some months before Mr. Tansy's arrival. This document, which appeared to have been prepared specifically for Mr. Pemberton's edification, included character assessments of significant village personalities, including Reverend Clement, various prominent parishioners, and even the village constabulary. Mr. Greaves had apparently travelled to Lymstock incognito for the purpose of gathering this intelligence, observing village life with the eye of someone conducting a scientific study of human psychology and social dynamics. The document contained observations regarding the village's religious convictions, its tendency towards superstition, its social hierarchies, and its patterns of gossip and rumour. Most chillingly, it contained explicit recommendations regarding which village individuals would be most susceptible to suspicion regarding religious fanaticism. Mr. Hopkins, the retired schoolmaster whose handwriting Mr. Greaves would later attempt to mimic in the scriptural notes, received particular attention in this assessment. Mr. Greaves noted that Mr. Hopkins's well-known religious convictions, combined with his social isolation and his tendency toward intemperate speech regarding moral matters, made him an ideal vessel upon which to pour suspicion for religiously motivated crime. Chapter 7. The Pious Notes Unmasked. The investigation into the origin of the scriptural notes proved particularly illuminating, for it revealed the depth of Mr. Pemberton's preparation and his understanding of village psychology. Each note had been composed with meticulous attention to scriptural authenticity, yet the selection of verses had been quite deliberate. Chosen specifically because they contained language that might appeal to those inclined towards religious extremism, while simultaneously directing suspicion away from property disputes. Inspector Slack assigned considerable resources to the forensic examination of these documents. The paper upon which the notes had been written was examined for distinctive characteristics, and it was determined that each sheet came from a particular ream of correspondence paper manufactured by a London stationery firm and distributed only to professional offices and individuals of substantial financial resources. The watermark visible in the paper proved to be registered to a batch specifically supplied to legal offices operating within a defined London postal district. The handwriting on the notes, though, when examined with scientific precision by a handwriting specialist brought from the Metropolitan Police, proved to be disguised with considerable sophistication. The analysis revealed that the person who wrote the notes had employed a technique whereby the natural characteristics of their writing hand had been deliberately suppressed in favour of mimicking the handwriting of another individual. This mimicry was not perfect, however. Under magnification and careful analysis, several letters revealed inconsistencies that proved revealing to the trained eye. Most significantly, the investigation into the method of disguise itself revealed something of considerable importance. The person who wrote the notes had attempted to mimic the handwriting of old Mr. Hopkins, the retired schoolmaster who was known throughout the village for his intense religious beliefs and his tendency to annotate Bible verses with considerable passion. His margins were crowded with theological commentary written in an idiosyncratic hand. Anyone visiting his residence would have encountered numerous examples of this distinctive handwriting adorning biblical volumes and theological texts throughout his library. This deliberate mimicry suggested that Mr. Pemberton, or more likely Mr. Greaves working at his direction, had identified in advance who the village would suspect, and had structured his entire scheme around ensuring that suspicion would naturally fall upon that individual. The evidence of Mr. Greaves's pre-arrival survey of Lymstock confirmed this interpretation. Mr. Greaves had apparently obtained samples of Mr. Though Hopkins' handwriting through various means, including letters to village institutions and notations in publicly accessible church documents, and had practiced reproducing this handwriting with sufficient precision that it would be convincing to anyone examining the scriptural notes without the benefit of professional analysis. "A clever man," Inspector Slack acknowledged grimly, examining the notes under magnification with the specialist brought from Scotland Yard. He identified the village's most convenient suspect before the crime was committed, and then constructed an elaborate framework of false evidence designed to ensure suspicion would attach to that individual. Yet it was precisely this cleverness that ultimately proved to be Mr. Pemberton's undoing. So elaborate had been his scheme, so carefully orchestrated the various elements of misdirection, that it revealed the hand of someone possessed of considerable education and foresight. Mr. Pitman, the verger, could never have conceived such a plan. His literacy was adequate to his duties, but his education extended no further than that necessary for a working man of limited means. Mr. Hopkins, whatever his religious obsessions, was incapable of such systematic duplicity. His character, while eccentric, bore all the hallmarks of genuine conviction rather than calculating deception. The murder bore all the hallmarks of someone with access to botanical supplies in London, legal knowledge of sufficient sophistication to understand how property disputes might be resolved through murder, and a comprehensive understanding of village personalities and psychology that went far beyond what could be acquired through casual residence or familial connection. The handwriting specialist brought from Scotland Yard concluded with professional certainty that the documents had been composed by someone possessed of considerable education and practiced facility with written composition. "Tell me, Inspector," Miss Marple inquired gently as the investigation neared its crucial conclusions, "has anyone examined the premises from which these botanical specimens are obtained? Might the London supplier not possess records indicating who recently acquired a Ricinus communis specimen? And more importantly, Might not the acquisition of such a specimen require correspondence with the supplier that could establish the identity of the purchaser with documentary precision? The inspector's face brightened at this suggestion, and it proved to be the crucial lead that transformed the investigation from a matter of circumstantial suspicion into something approaching definitive proof. Records from the botanical supplier, a firm of considerable repute that served educational institutions, private collectors, and research establishments throughout England, revealed that someone had indeed ordered not merely one but 2 Ricinus communis specimens within the preceding 6 months. The most significant detail, however, concerned the method of payment and delivery. The first specimen, ordered approximately 7 months prior to Mr. Tansy's death, had been delivered to an address in London associated with Mr. Greaves's legal offices. The second specimen, ordered 3 months prior to Mr. Tansy's arrival, had been delivered to a private address in the vicinity of Lymstock, using the name P. Thornton and payment through a banking arrangement that concealed the ultimate source of the funds. When the investigator from Scotland Yard visited the address where the second specimen had been delivered, the household confirmed receipt of a botanical package 3 months prior. The recipient had been a gentleman of professional bearing who had identified himself as a botanist conducting private research. The description provided by the household member matched, in all essential respects, the known appearance of Mr. Pemberton during the period in question. Most damning of all, payment for these specimens had been made through banking arrangements that traced directly back to Mr. Pemberton's personal accounts. The use of the alias P. Thornton and the deliberate separation of the 2 transactions across 6 months and between 2 different locations suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond the spontaneous murder committed in response to an immediate threat. Rather, it indicated an individual who had been contemplating the murder of Mr. Tansy for many months, preparing methodically for the moment when circumstances would allow him to implement his plan. Combined with Mr. Pitman's testimony regarding the money received, Reverend Clement's acknowledgement that Mr. Pemberton had shown unusual interest in access to the vicarage gardens during the months preceding Mr. Tansy's arrival, and the specialist analysis of the scriptural notes identifying them as products of an educated and calculated mind, the case against Mr. Pemberton proved overwhelming in its comprehensiveness. Chapter 8. The Solicitor's Silent Partner. Yet even as Mr. Pemberton's arrest seemed imminent, one final revelation emerged that suggested the conspiracy extended deeper than anyone had initially recognised. Examination of Mr. Pemberton's correspondence revealed that he had been in communication with a London solicitor, a man named Mr. Greaves, who had provided not merely legal advice regarding the property dispute, but also logistical support for the murder plot itself. Mr. Greaves, it appeared, had been the intermediary who arranged for the acquisition of the Ricinus communis specimen, and who had suggested the scriptural notes as an effective means of misdirection. His correspondence with Mr. Pemberton revealed a man of considerable intellectual capacity and dubious moral principles, one who viewed murder as simply another problem requiring a calculated solution. This man, Greaves, Inspector Slack said, his expression grim, appears to have been something rather more than a solicitor. He reads like a criminal mastermind who chooses to disguise his activities behind a facade of legal respectability. When the London authorities were contacted and Mr. Greaves's offices examined, evidence emerged of a far more extensive criminal enterprise. Mr. Greaves had apparently made a specialty of assisting clients in eliminating inconvenient individuals through elaborate schemes designed to misdirect suspicion toward convenient suspects. His files contained documentation of at least a dozen cases in which his involvement could be demonstrated. though securing convictions for murders perpetrated in previous years would prove challenging given the passage of time and the destruction of evidence. "It is a sobering thought," Miss Marple observed as the full scope of Mr. Greaves's criminal activities came to light, "that modern civilization, with all its legal structures and professional institutions, provides such excellent cover for the most calculated species of murderer. A man of education and resources, operating behind the facade of legitimate professional activity, the CSR, can perpetrate crimes of considerable brutality with a high degree of confidence that he will escape detection." Chapter 9. Scripture twisted to serve evil. As the various perpetrators were apprehended and remanded into custody, attention turned to the question of how religious language had been so deliberately perverted to serve the purposes of murder and fraud. It was a question that troubled Reverend Clement considerably, and one that he discussed at considerable length with Miss Marple during her visit to the vicarage in the aftermath of the investigation's conclusion. "The Bible contains extraordinary wisdom and insight regarding human nature," the Reverend said, his voice weighted with sadness. "Yet it can equally be twisted to justify virtually any act of violence or deception. Mr. Pemberton and Mr. Greaves demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of scriptural language, employing it not to illuminate truth, but to conceal it." "In my experience," Miss Marple replied gently, "the appearance of piety is often adopted by those whose inner nature is most thoroughly corrupted. The thief advertises his honesty, the adulterer speaks constantly of virtue, and the murderer conceals his intentions beneath a surface of moral righteousness." Mr. Pemberton understood that a village such as Lymstock, with its strong ecclesiastical traditions and its tendency toward religious expression, would instinctively interpret scriptural language as indicative of genuine moral conviction rather than calculated deception. The discovery of Mr. Greaves's private journals reveal the depth of his cynicism regarding religion and morality. He had maintained voluminous notes on what he termed the susceptibility of religious communities to scriptural misdirection. He had studied village life extensively, identifying patterns of belief and superstition that could be exploited through carefully constructed religious language. His analysis of Lymstock, composed months before Mr. Tansy's arrival, proved chillingly prescient regarding the effectiveness of his planned misdirection. He was conducting a species of scientific experiment, Inspector Slack observed, with evident disgust, examining Mr. Greaves's meticulous notes, testing his theories regarding the manipulability of religious conviction against the reality of a specific village community. "A detestable abuse of intelligence," Miss Marple agreed, "yet it demonstrates an important principle regarding the investigation of crime. When one observes elaborate misdirection employed in service of apparent religious obsession, one should ask oneself whether the religion itself is perhaps the misdirection rather than the true motive." Chapter 10. Winter settles over the village. By the time winter descended upon Lymstock in earnest, the investigation had concluded and the various perpetrators had been brought to account. The legal proceedings against Mr. Pemberton and Mr. Greaves extended well into the new year, with barristers from London travelling to the assizes to present evidence of the conspiracy that had culminated in Mr. Tansy's death. The trial itself generated considerable attention in the national press, with particular emphasis being placed upon the sophisticated nature of the criminal conspiracy and the elaborate psychological manipulation that had characterized the approach of Mr. Greaves. Mr. Pemberton, confronted with documentary evidence of his communications with Mr. Greaves and the botanical records establishing his acquisition of the Ricinus communis specimens, eventually entered a plea of guilty to the charge of murder. His defense counsel argued for leniency on the grounds that he had been manipulated by Mr. Greaves, who possessed superior intelligence and more comprehensive knowledge of criminal enterprise. The judge, however, was unmoved by such arguments, observing from the bench that ignorance of the law could never serve as a defence to murder, and that the deliberate planning evident in Mr. Pemberton's actions suggested a degree of intentionality that precluded any claim of victimisation. Mr. Pemberton received a sentence of death, which was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment following a petition to the Home Office emphasising his advanced age and declining health. He would spend the remainder of his days in custody, his vast fortune liquidated to compensate the church for the stolen minerals and to provide damages to the family of the deceased. Mr. Greaves mounted a more vigorous defence, arguing that his role had been limited to providing legal advice, and that he bore no direct responsibility for Mr. Pemberton's criminal actions. The prosecution, however, proved able to establish through documentary evidence and the testimony of former clients that Mr. Greaves had been engaged systematically in the provision of murder planning services for a period of many years. The letters discovered in his files, particularly those discussing the construction of narratives designed to misdirect suspicion, were determined to constitute explicit conspiracy to commit murder. Mr. Greaves received a sentence of 30 years, a determination that seemed likely to result in his spending the remainder of his life in prison. Mr. Pitman, the verger, received a sentence of 15 years, with the judge acknowledging his cooperation with the authorities and his evident remorse, while nevertheless emphasising the gravity of his participation in a premeditated murder. It was a sentence that Pitman appeared to accept with something approaching relief, as though the burden of concealment had been weightier than the prospect of imprisonment. The village of Lymstock, in the aftermath of these revelations, settled into a period of quiet reflection regarding the nature of community and the ease with which comfortable assumptions might conceal darker realities. The scriptural notes preserved as evidence during the trial were eventually returned to Reverend Clement, who kept them locked away in his study as a permanent reminder of how religious language might be corrupted and twisted to serve the purposes of the morally corrupt. The notes themselves became the subject of considerable discussion in ecclesiastical circles throughout the country. The bishop of the diocese commissioned a theological study examining the question of how genuine religious conviction might be distinguished from its calculated simulation. Several academic papers examining the psychological mechanisms of religious misdirection emerged in the years following the case, with scholars attempting to understand the psychological vulnerabilities that might render a community susceptible to such manipulation. Reverend Clement, his health substantially compromised by the stress of the investigation and its aftermath, gradually withdrew from active parish duties over the following years. The bulk of responsibility was passed to a new curate, a man named Mr. Bradford, whose primary qualifications appeared to be a profound lack of initiative regarding either ecclesiastical matters or property disputes, combined with a complete absence of interest in botanical specimens of any variety. The parish of Lymstock, it seemed, had learned its lesson regarding the dangers of employing energetic and intellectually ambitious assistants to the clergy. The vicarage gardens, which had once been a source of pride to Reverend Clement, and a repository of rare and scientifically significant botanical specimens, gradually fell into disrepair. The more exotic plants were destroyed or allowed to die, replaced by ordinary rose gardens and utilitarian vegetable patches that presented no possibility of poisoning anyone, regardless of the calculations of criminal minds. The Reverend's scientific collection was dispersed to various botanical institutions and universities, Syria, where the specimens could be studied and preserved without the constant concern that they might be employed as instruments of murder. It was on a particularly cold evening in December, nearly a year after the discovery of Mr. Tansy's body, that Miss Marple sat by her fire with Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the winter wind howling outside the windows and snow accumulating upon the roofs of the village. The two women were engaged in the sort of quiet conversation that characterized their friendship, a dialogue conducted with the understanding that came from decades of mutual acquaintance. The most remarkable aspect of this entire affair, Mrs. Calthrop observed, her knitting creating a rhythmic clicking sound in the warmth of the fire, is how thoroughly the perpetrators understood human psychology and the power of expectation in shaping perception. Mr. Pemberton and Mr. Greaves did not merely create false evidence, they created a narrative so compelling that the entire village accepted it as truth, before the evidence had been properly examined. A narrative rooted in fear, Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, her own hands occupied with embroidery work that had been interrupted by this more serious conversation. Religious fanaticism represents a genuine concern in village life, something that frightens people who have grown accustomed to orderly ecclesiastical routine. By triggering this pre-existing anxiety, Mr. Greaves ensured that suspicion would flow naturally toward his constructed suspects rather than toward the actual beneficiary of the crime. He understood that fear makes people credulous, that it disposes them toward accepting explanations that seem to account for their anxiety, regardless of whether those explanations are rooted in reality. And the poor Mr. Hopkins, Mrs. Calthrop continued, was quite unaware that he had been constructed as the village's preferred suspect before the murder was even committed. It is a sobering thought, Jane, that we might be shaped unknowingly into positions of suspicion by those who understand our psychology more thoroughly than we understand ourselves. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, which suggests to me that the exercise of judgment regarding the actions of others requires considerably more humility than we typically display. When we observe what appears to be religious fanaticism or moral extremism, we should perhaps pause before declaring it authentic. We should ask ourselves whether what we're observing might not be performance rather than conviction, whether the appearance of piety might not be precisely that, an appearance designed to serve purposes that remain hidden from our view. As the winter deepened and snow continued to accumulate upon the ancient roofs of Lymstock, Miss Marple reflected upon the curious nature of human villainy. The most dangerous criminals were rarely those who committed crimes in passion or desperation, driven by the immediate pressures of circumstances or the violent impulses of nature. Rather, they were those who possessed sufficient intelligence and patience to construct elaborate frameworks of deception, who understood human psychology with sufficient precision to manipulate entire communities into accepting false narratives, and who possessed the moral flexibility to view human life as merely another problem requiring a calculated solution. The case of Mr. Tansy's death, and the elaborate conspiracy that had culminated in his demise, had demonstrated conclusively that greed, when combined with education and cunning, represented a far greater threat to village security than religious obsession, regardless of how compelling the surface appearance of religious motivation might appear. A fool might commit murder in the heat of anger or the grip of genuine conviction, but a man of intelligence and education, a man who had thought deeply about human nature and the mechanisms through which societies organize themselves, such a man could commit murder while rendering himself invisible to suspicion, could destroy lives while the community itself participated unknowingly in the preservation of his anonymity. As the evening deepened and the fire burned low, Miss Marple set aside her embroidery and gazed thoughtfully into the flames. The most elaborate deceptions, she reflected, are often constructed by those who understand most thoroughly how to manipulate the expectations and anxieties of their chosen victims. And the most tragic aspect of such deceptions is that they render suspect all conviction, all passion, all sincere belief. In corrupting the language of religion to serve the purposes of murder, Mr. Greaves and Mr. Pemberton had accomplished something far more sinister than the mere elimination of an inconvenient individual. They had introduced into the village a permanent doubt regarding the authenticity of religious conviction itself, And that doubt, once introduced into a community, spreads like poison through the soil, rendering uncertain all claims to truth and goodness and moral certainty. Yet human nature, Miss Marple thought, possessed remarkable resilience. The village would survive this corruption. Reverend Clement would continue his ministry, diminished perhaps, but persisting. The parishioners would continue their faithful practice of religion, though with perhaps a greater awareness of the human capacity for corruption. And those charged with the investigation and prosecution of crime would take from this case a lesson regarding the sophisticated weapons that might be employed in service of evil, and the necessity of examining not merely the surface appearance of motive, but the deeper patterns of greed and calculation that so often underlay the most carefully constructed deceptions.